Well, good morning, dear friends, and welcome to St. Stephen's on this special occasion. Our annual celebration of Lady Loretta de Braose, who was an anchoress here at St. Stephen's in Canterbury from around 1221 till her death in 1264, and lived probably in a cell adjoining the south wall somewhere. We believe somewhere around there where the plaque is going to be dedicated later on this morning. So welcome to this introduction, really, to the time of Loretta. First of all, I'm going to give a talk on the times, the context of the times in which Loretta lived, and I hope that will fill in some of the background. And then Dr. Peter Toon is going to talk about the effect that Loretta might have on anyone who wants to live the anchoritic life in the 21st century. And Peter's going to talk about his own experience of lockdown, I think, and how that kind of equated to a semi-anchoritic life. So as a way of anchoring our thoughts for today, which we celebrate this great anchoress, I want to begin suggesting that we cannot understand anyone without understanding the times in which they lived. Lady Loretta lived through a particularly turbulent time in English history. I say that, and yet all times are turbulent, but also an exciting time in the life of the church. Her early life as a member of the aristocracy led to an experience of losing her parents and being forced into exile due to the clash between King John and his barons. A marriage to the Earl of Leicester confirmed her status as a high-ranking person, but also meant that she was widowed at an early age. Her exile in Paris led to friendship with the Langton brothers, who were senior clerics, and perhaps the experience of new and interesting religious movements such as the female mystics and the Franciscans. So as we try to piece together the picture of Loretta's times from around 1170 to 1264, the year in which she died, I want to draw out a number of themes that might help us to make sense of Loretta's decision to devote herself to a life of solitary prayer. So first of all, her family background. The House of Braose, or Braose, as it should probably be referred to, was a Norman barony that, like many of the aristocratic houses, came to England during the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror gave the rape of Bamber in Sussex to William, the first Earl, and he built a castle there. His son Philip conquered Radnor and Builth in Wales, and they acquired the moiety of Totnes, where Baldwin, the future archbishop, and Walter de Grey, who will also figure later in the story, were archdeacons. The fourth Earl of Bamber, William, Loretta's father, lived from 1144 to 1211. Around 1166-67, he married Mathilde, or Maud, born in France to the de Valery family, who held the manor of Hinton near Oxford, and she features in many Welsh myths. Her exploits include the building of the castle of Hay-on-Wye, it's said, in one night. Her title was Lady of Hay, and also leading her army into battle in full armour. She was said to be very tall, and obviously a very formidable woman. William is noted for the massacre of Abergavenny in 1175, when he invited the Welsh nobles to Abergavenny Castle to make peace, only instead to murder them all. During his time of Sheriff of Herefordshire between 1192 and 1199, he accompanied Richard I to France during his quarrel with the King of France. And when Richard died, there was a dispute about the English succession. William supported John and subsequently became John's favourite baron. In 1203, William held Arthur, John's nephew, and a suitor for the throne who'd been captured at the Battle of Mirebeau in 1202, held him captive, and some suggest that Arthur died whilst in William's custody, rather conveniently for John. William was a marcher lord, those most powerful barons who controlled Wales. But the thing that got him into hot water with King John was the issue of lands that he owned and controlled in Ireland, in conjunction with many of the other marcher lord families. William was Lord of Limerick. The de Lacys were lords of Meath and Ulster, and William Marshall, the Earl of Pembroke, was Lord of Leinster. Towards 1208, King John took an interest, could say an overbearing interest, in his Irish territories, and demanded revenue from his Irish lords. He was suspicious of their loyalty. So he demanded 40,000 marks from William de Braose, and when he failed to pay, fearing for his life, he fled to take refuge with the de Lacys in Ireland. When John banished the de Lacys to France in 1210, William sent his family away. For the next thing we hear is that his wife Matilde and son William had been captured on their way to Scotland, and they were then starved to death in Corfe Castle after a short imprisonment in Windsor. William fled to Paris, as did his daughters and others implicated in the plot against John. He died in exile in 1211 and was buried by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop, who will feature later in the story, at the Abbey of St. Victor. And that raises my first question about where Loretta spent her exile in Paris. Could it have been at the Abbey of St. Victor? And was this how she came to have a special relationship with the Langtons? It's an interesting question, and I can't answer it. In 1196, Loretta married Robert de Beaumont, also known as Robert de Bretreuil, and Robert Fitzparnell, the fourth Earl of Leicester. Like her own family, Robert's family had arrived in England with William the Conqueror and still owned large parts of Normandy. He was Lord High Steward of England, and after accompanying King Richard on crusade, he held that post from 1109 to his death in 1204. With no children, Loretta was widowed after 8 years of marriage, and the estate fell to Robert's sisters and would eventually, of course, become the fiefdom of Simon de Montfort, who inherited the title of Earl of Leicester. Loretta then was in exile from 1208 to 1213. So why then did she end up in Canterbury? Well, from an ancient land survey recorded on British History Online, I discovered that Loretta took up residence at a place called Hore, or Hague Manor, which had been one of the possessions of the Earl of Leicester, and actually seems to be the same place as Little Hall Farm, which is in Aldcroft Grange. And for those who don't know that, that's just at the top of the hill, opposite the road to the university. So she was living not very far from here. That she was able to support herself, we know from evidence uncovered by the Magna Carta Project, which says that on her husband's death, she was promised an extensive settlement of dower, including the manor of Torstock near Barnstaple in Devon. You remember Baldwin and Walter de Grey were archdeacons of Totnes, part of that fealty. So St. Stephen's would have been her parish church, and as it seems that it was visited by many pilgrims as a consequence of having a miraculous image of St. Stephen, presumably it would have been a very wealthy parish. With everything that had happened in her turbulent life, I wonder if it's any wonder that Loretta would want to settle down here to a life of quiet and prayer in a place associated with martyrdom and miracles. So I want, before we look at the religious context of Loretta's time, to remind us of the great political events that were shaping the times. The most important would have been the struggle to retain Norman and other lands in France, the continuing crusades both in the Holy Land and in southern France against the Cathars, the struggle for power between the king and the English barons, including the attempts to extend control over Wales and Ireland, and the business of revenue rights and taxes, which of course is the thing that led to the signing of Magna Carta in 1215. John became king in 1199, and having not departed for the Fourth Crusade in 1200, then decided to abandon his first wife, Isabella of Gloucester, in order to marry Isabella of Angoulême. John's reign, I think as we all know, was troubled, just like his father's, with struggles with the church and with his barons. It was during John's time that the great exile of church leaders and a papal ban on services took place between 1208 and 1213. For 5 years, no services were allowed to be said in England. But significantly, the struggle with the barons led to the signing of Magna Carta, which was immediately declared invalid by Pope Innocent III, and which triggered the First Barons' War. John died at Newark Castle in 1216, and although he was succeeded by Henry III, the first years of Henry's reign were overseen by William Marshal, the first Earl of Pembroke. Henry III turned out to be a very religious king, making Edward the Confessor patron saint of England. But his attempt to regain French lands turned into a bit of a debacle, and his reign was marred by his appalling treatment of the Jews, unfortunately supported by the Archbishop and his Archdeacon, the Langtons. Loretta's period ends with the revolt of her nephew, Simon de Montfort, against the king and his seizure of power in 1263, causing the Second Barons' War. Money and territory formed the world in which Loretta lived, not that it doesn't in every age, but the church was associated closely with that power struggle. Thomas Becket, you may remember, was Chancellor from 1155 to 1162. Baldwin had collected taxes or tithes for the Third Crusade. Hubert Walter was Chancellor from 1199 to 1205, and Walter de Grey from 1205 to 1214. So not just archbishops, but leading politicians too. The archbishops held extensive lands and territories, including this village of Hackington, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So what about the religious situation of Loretta's time? With the arrival of the Normans, there was this great rush to build churches and cathedrals. Canterbury Cathedral was being rebuilt following the fire of 1174. Lichfield Cathedral was started 1048, Exeter 1050, Chichester 1080, Norwich 1094, and then Salisbury and Wells 1227, 1239. It's a huge building programme. Old St Paul's had been destroyed by a fire in 1087 and was being rebuilt, whilst there were Benedictine priories in Westminster, St Albans, Worcester, Winchester, Rochester, and among others, an Augustinian priory at Southwark. Canterbury itself boasted 3 large religious communities at the time. There's Christchurch Priory, St Augustine's Abbey, both of which were Benedictine, of course, and St Gregory's Priory, which was an Augustinian house, and which was the home for the Archdeacons of Canterbury, their entrance being in Rottington Lane until about 1227. The newly formed Cistercian order arrived in 1128, first of all building Waverley Abbey in Surrey, and then spread outwards very rapidly across the whole country. It was from the newly formed Abbey of Ford that Baldwin the Archbishop, who was to attempt the building of a college of secular canons here at Hackington. Baldwin was abbot of the Abbey of Ford. And Baldwin's scheme to build that great church at Hackington, dedicated to St. Stephen and St. Thomas, a project he carried out between 1185 and 1190 when he was Archbishop, caused not only friction with the monks of Canterbury, he imprisoned them for a year and a half, but also brought censure from Pope Innocent III, caused the king, King Richard, and his mother, Queen Eleanor, to return to Canterbury in 1189 to try and settle the dispute. Interestingly, Hubert Walter, who followed Baldwin as Archbishop, also tried to resurrect the scheme in the 1190s. It says something about Hackington, and I'm not quite sure what. But the project was doomed to failure, and the materials were eventually used for the building of Lambeth Palace, which was purchased in 1200. So that Hackington was important, I think, is confirmed by Baldwin and Walter and Loretta's choice of location. But it doesn't explain why Hackington was important, and I'd love to be able to get to the bottom of that question. Baldwin's quarrel with the monks reflected a wider quarrel about authority that had come to head in Becket's time. The same situation arose several times, but most notably for us in the case of Stephen Langton. When Archbishop Walter died in 1205, there was a dispute over who should be the next archbishop. And the monks elected Reginald, their sub-prior, whilst the king proposed John de Grey, who was Bishop of Norwich. De Grey, who died in 1214, had been consecrated alongside Loretta's brother Giles, who was Bishop of Hereford. And de Grey was a member of the family that built Gray's Inn, and of which Lady Jane Grey was to be a member a few centuries later. John de Grey's nephew, Simon, had been proposed as Archbishop of York, pipping Simon Langton to the post, if you like. Simon was proposed by the canons of York, but Walter de Grey had been proposed by the king, and that decision was upheld by the Pope. The Langtons, from a minor noble family in Rugby in Lincolnshire, were both prebendaries of Strensall near York. But Stephen Langton became a friend of Pope Innocent III, and in that dispute over future archbishops of Canterbury, the Pope decided to overrule both the monks and the king and presented his friend Cardinal Stephen Langton. Stephen had spent 25 years of his life at the University of Paris as a theologian, and that's where he met the future Pope Innocent III. Innocent III, if you remember, presided over the Fourth Lateran Council, which asserted the supremacy of the church over earthly rulers, promoted crusades against heresy, but also turned out to be very anti-Jewish. Stephen Langton gained a reputation for being anti-Jewish, and he helped to fuel the anti-Jewish persecutions of the 1220s. As a theologian's theologian, Stephen taught courses based on the sentences of Peter Lombard, but he would have also been aware of the Victorines, especially Richard of St. Victor, because of the nascent relationship between the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, the Abbey of Saint-Geneviève, and the Abbey of St. Victor, which had recently been combined as colleges of the University of Paris. Could be that Stephen, well, I'm sure Stephen would have met Loretta in Paris during the exile, and that he was at least partly responsible for locating her here at Hackington. Like Loretta's father, Langton had fallen foul of King John and been exiled, and as I said earlier, buried Loretta's father at St. Victor in 1211. For a lot of that period, he resided at the Cistercian Abbey of Pontigny, where Becket had also taken refuge, and where Langton's successor, Edmund Rich, would also be buried. Simon may not have been in Canterbury when Loretta was enclosed, so I wonder if she was enclosed by the Archbishop, by Archbishop Stephen, rather than by Simon Langton. Simon enters the picture in 1208 when he became an intermediary between King John and his brother. He must have been much younger than Stephen, probably being born somewhere in the 1180s, and again may have been educated at the University of Paris. Simon spent much of his time in diplomatic activity, negotiating for his brother and attempting to smooth relations between King John and the Pope and the King of France. And he served as Chancellor to King Louis of France from 1216. After being absolved by the King and the Pope for trying to engineer Louis's claim to the English crown, so Simon was obviously the Francophile of the family, he returned from exile and entered into a period of favour with King and Pope. He became Archdeacon of Canterbury in 1227. Interestingly, Pope Gregory IX sought his advice about who should become Archbishop in 1231. And Simon was so powerful that he prevented the consecration of Ralph Neville, who'd been the Bishop of Chichester. And he did the same thing in 1233. Obviously very influential, but he did support Archbishop Edmund Rich in 1238 when a dispute arose again between the Archbishop and the monks. Gervase, the monk of Canterbury and historian, denounced Simon's memory as accursed. Matthew Paris wrote that it's no wonder if he was a persecutor and disturber of his own Church of Canterbury, seeing that he was a stirrer-up of strife throughout the whole realms of England and France. So, an influential character, but maybe not a very nice character. And as the lecture that we had on Simon Langton a few years ago suggested, it's a possibility Simon Langton may also be buried here. He did have the big house next door. Simon Langton is associated with the founding of the Poor Priest Hospital in Canterbury in 1217, the origin of Simon Langton Grammar School, and he may have been instrumental in bringing the Franciscans to Canterbury along with Lady Loretta. The Franciscans had been founded in 1209, and in 1224, Agnalos of Pisa led a mission to England where they built the first friary, Grey Friars, and that was turned into a stone building in 1267. So Loretta's times were religiously exciting. The Cistercians had started their expansion throughout Europe during the previous century, now complementing the well-established Benedictines and the Augustinians. But the religious revival that this signal resulted also in the founding of the Franciscans and the Dominicans at the beginning of the 13th century, whilst the mysticism that had been spreading gradually from Germany and the Low Countries resulted in many women taking up the religious life. It's estimated that there were 200 female anchorites in England alone during the 13th century. 200 during that single century, of which Loretta and her sister were prominent examples. I wonder, could it be that their decision to enter the enclosure of an anchoress were influenced by the melting pot that was Paris in the early 1200s? Did they pick most of that up from their time in Paris? The mysticism of Hildegard and her like was probably being talked about. The mystical theology of Richard of St. Victor would have formed part of the theological debate in which they were involved. It's difficult to say, but one article I've read also points to the connection between the anchorite movement, particularly in the Welsh marches where Loretta came from, and the preaching of the Crusades. So there was certainly a spirit of religious fervency during that period in which Loretta lived. It's not surprising that many got caught up in its wake, either joining new religious movements, going on crusade, zealously fighting heresy, or taking up the religious life. As in Loretta's and Honora's cases, taking up the religious life of a hermit or an anchorite. So I hope that sets some of the background to Loretta, who we're here to celebrate today. There are a few more things in the paper that I've written on this background, and they'll eventually appear on our church website. But I hope that gives you an insight into Loretta's times. I'm not a medieval specialist. I wouldn't consider myself an academic, but that's what I've gleaned from the various bits of writing and reading that I've discovered. I hope that's helpful. I'm going to invite Dr. Peter Toon now to talk about contemporary anchoretic life.
Thank you, Kevin. To most of us in the 21st century, the idea that a wealthy woman in her late 20s, as we've heard, would choose to spend the rest of her life in one room, like Lady Loretta, seems bizarre, even mad. But perhaps it does make more sense in the context of her history and the history of our times, which Kevin's been telling us about. Because apart from the anchor hold, in the 13th century, a young wealthy widow really had only two choices: remarry or enter a nunnery. If she married, she'd face a life of childbearing and doing what her husband wanted. If she entered a nunnery, she'd give up control to her superiors in the order. As an anchoress, she was only responsible to her bishop. So by giving up freedom of movement, she actually kept her independence in other ways, as, for example, we can see from her support for the Franciscans, who at that time were quite subversive and radical. They still are, actually. We know from the letter that she received near the end of her life about the rights and duties of the Earl of Leicester, that 40 years later she'd maintained her reputation as somewhat of importance. Would that have happened if she'd married or entered a nunnery? Also, we need to think about her life up to that point. She got married, as wealthy young girls did at that age, in her early teens, to a husband who promptly went to war and got himself killed. Then she was deprived of her dowry by a king who killed her mother and brother and forced her into exile. Although when she went into enclosure, King John was thankfully dead, there was no knowing what his son Henry, who was only 14 at that time, would turn out like. If when he came of age he behaved like his father, perhaps being locked in a church cell was actually the safer option. So an anchorite life may have made sense for Loretta, but what does it have to teach us today? In the last 3 years, we've all had a brief and partial experience of the enclosed life during the lockdowns introduced to control the COVID pandemic. We stayed at home not to avoid a murderous king or being controlled by others, but to keep ourselves and others safe from a potentially fatal virus. Of course, our enclosure was far less extreme than that of Lady Loretta's. We were in our homes, which for most of us is more than a single room. And some of us had gardens, as of course did some anchoresses, though there's no evidence that Loretta had one. We were allowed out for socially distanced exercise. Their only exercise was the movements required by their religious observances: kneeling, bowing, crossing themselves, though that kept Loretta fit enough to live into her 80s. But nevertheless, our period of partial enclosure gave us an opportunity to review the balance between what we might call travelling out and travelling in. By travelling out, I mean going round the world, socialising, or for other pleasurable activities like the cinema, the theatre, holidays. For many people, that's what life's about. One of my favourite novelists, Rose Macaulay, thought travel was the chief end of life. Although well-off people in the 13th century got about a lot more than we tend to think, going on crusades or pilgrimages, buying and selling things, or just visiting people. Far fewer travelled than do so today, and since they did it on foot or horseback or by sailing ship, they did so with a far smaller carbon footprint than we do. Because travel, and particularly air travel, plays a significant role in global warming, estimated as 4 to 5% of the total effects of our emissions, travelling out has an impact, not only on the quality of life of individuals, but on the health of our planet. As a supporter of the Franciscans, perhaps Lady Loretta would have been keen on us looking after our planet by staying still. The contrasting idea of travelling in is often seen as a way of referring to spiritual exploration and growth. Monica Furlong used that very title for a book on meditation, and St. Teresa Avila used the metaphor of exploring an interior castle for the spiritual life. This sort of travelling in is valuable and perhaps undervalued in our society, but there are lots of other explorations we can undertake without leaving home, as many of us discovered during lockdown. Since the invention of printing, reading has been a way we could explore other worlds, imaginary ones, in novels, our own worlds through non-fiction books, without moving from our fireside. Through modern technology, we can also explore the worlds of music, film and theatre from our own home. Not to mention, of course, the hobbies we've always been able to pursue at home: music making, knitting, needlework, wood turning, painting, so on. Many of what Alistair MacIntyre would call practices, activities which contribute to our human flourishing. Although Loretta stayed in one room, she wasn't cut off from the rest of the world. She had a window into the church through which you could take part in worship, a window to the outside world where people could come and seek her advice, or the guide for anchoresses, the anchoresses, stresses it shouldn't be used for too much gossip and chattering. And a third window through which her maidservant could provide her food and other basic necessities. Zoom and YouTube can be electronic versions of Loretta's windows because they can enable us to share in worship and also have useful communication with other people from home. Unusually for anchoresses, Loretta also had a manservant who carried messages around the country for her. For us, email and telephone do that. Perhaps her third window has been replaced by mains plumbing and online grocery delivery services. I'm not, of course, suggesting that we should all go home, shut our doors and never come out. Even in the 13th century, the anchor hold was a lifestyle chosen only by a small minority. 200 people is a lot, but it's only a very small fraction of the population of England at that time. But as COVID ceases to be a life-threatening pandemic and becomes just another of the ills that we are heir to, and as we begin Lent, perhaps part of our reflection on our lifestyle as we think about Loretta should be examining the balance in our lives between travelling out and travelling in, for each of us individually, but also for society as a whole. The psychoanalyst Michael Barland advised overactive doctors to don't just do something, sit there. Perhaps we need to think whether that applies to us rather than assuming we should get back to normal, as people often seem to be talking about in relationship to the pandemic. A lot of people have stopped travelling out for work. In February 2002, 84% of those who'd had to work from home for coronavirus said they planned to continue a mixture of working at home and working in their place of work. Business travel's fallen too. A survey last August found that 49% of those surveyed were less likely to travel for business at that time, and 27% said they were less likely to do so in the long term. When people realise that some of their meetings can take place online, why would they want to spend time and money hanging around in airports or railway stations or sitting in a queue on the M1? And since travel is a good way to spend pandemic infections, doing less of it may be good for our own health as well as that of the planet. The social changes resulting from these and other post-pandemic changes in behaviour are likely to be considerable. For example, train tables will need to change to reflect new travel patterns. Apparently, a lot of commuter trains now run half empty on Mondays and Fridays when people work from home. We'll need fewer cafes and sandwich shops in business centres and perhaps more delis and cafes near where we live. The need for office space will change too, and perhaps in the longer term, even how we organise our houses. Remember, until the 18th century, very few people went to work in the modern sense. Farmers and labourers, of course, went to the fields, but for many people, weavers, potters, merchants, the workplace was was part of their home. Perhaps more of us will find ourselves doing that. I find it disappointing, although perhaps not surprising, that we've seen so little thinking about how, as a society, we need to adapt to those trends to improve both our individual qualities of life and the health of our planet. Much discussion seems to see a return to the status quo ante as what we should be looking for. The survey on business travel I mentioned earlier spoke of signs of recovery and green shoots of hope that travel will increase. Perhaps it might make more sense to ask people, as they were in the Second World War, is your journey really necessary? And there are lots of other questions we need to ask too. How do we fund activities like film, concerts and theatre, when quite a lot of the audience prefer to engage with them online from home? There are questions for the church too. The pandemic caused an explosion in online worship. A few years ago, I came down with bronchitis on Palm Sunday, and I struggled to find the Holy Week and Easter liturgy online. All I could find were services from a Roman Catholic cathedral in the United States. Now many churches, including this church and our cathedral, have more people viewing their services on YouTube than attend in person. This talk and the prayers which will follow are being live streamed and will be available to catch up for those who can't be here this morning. In some ways, this is great, particularly for disabled and the housebound. I know my parents, who could rarely get to church in the last years of their life, would have loved being able to take part in their familiar worship in this way. And it's not just the elderly. The needs of childcare keep many young parents away from church. But against this, some people find it harder to give their full attention to worship with the distractions of home around. We need to think through, discuss, and perhaps even learn how to worship online. But being part of a church is more than just taking part in services. The fellowship, the sense of belonging to the body of Christ, is facilitated by those chats we have in the churchyard or over coffee after our services. Again, we need to learn how to do this online. For this purpose, perhaps interactive media like Zoom may be better than live streaming. I regularly join in Zoom services with my church in France, and it does make me feel part of that community when I can't be with them as I am when I'm in my flat in the south of France. Another thing we need to be aware of is what you might call the Facebook news problem. Online media and online relationships can select what you see so that it's always in line with what you already believe. It's easy to find like-minded people from any part of the world and not be challenged by those whom we find difficult or who think differently, something which often happens in our local churches. So there's a lot to think about as we move forward into the new post-pandemic world. I don't have any clear answers, even for myself, let alone for anyone else. But I hope thinking about this will raise some questions as we think about what the life of Lady Loretta has to teach us today. Thank you. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and discussion to either to Kevin and or myself. Have we got a roving mic? Questions, comments, barracking? Victoria.
Thank you both very much. It was really, really interesting. I wonder if anybody knows anything about how Lady Loretta's cell disappeared and whether Manwood had anything to do with it.
Well, we know that this area was completely rebuilt in the 16th century by Manwood. What happened between Loretta and that, I don't think we know, do we, Kevin?
I don't think we've got any idea, including the archaeologists at the moment, without significant excavation, about what happened to the cell. The house, Simon Langton's palace that he built as Archdeacon of Canterbury, that remained the home of the archdeacons until the Reformation, at which point it became property of the king, which is why it was given to Manwood. Manwood knocked down that house and built his own house. So we know that Manwood knocked down the archdeacon's palace. So it could be that Manwood knocked down whatever building was attached to the church. But there again, I mean, there was, 3-4 centuries between, so it may have just fallen into disrepair or may have been dismantled before that.
We do know that there was, or we think, from somebody who did a thesis on the church architecture some while ago, that the chancel was shorter and both the transepts were apsidal at the time of Loretta. A few years ago, I revised the history of an architectural guide to the church that John Hayes had done many years ago, and that's on the website. You can find that, and there is a picture of suggested ideas about the plan of the church. So the chancel was rebuilt, so that might have involved destroying Loretta's anchor hold as well. There are very few anchor holds that remain at Loretta's sister's anchor hold in Ifley, Anora, her sister Anora. There's just a sort of a little door, I think, a little spot where they know where it was, but nothing. And of course, we don't even know if it would have been stone. It might have just been a wooden shed. It would have been two rooms, because she had her room, and then there was a room beyond it, which was a sort of kitchen where the maid did all the practical things. Yeah, if you've got another one.
I was thinking about the most famous anchorite, Dame Julian, who obviously was a writer. Do we know if Loretta was literate, whether she might have written and it's disappeared, or whether she didn't write?
We don't know. It's most likely, I would have thought, that I think that the manservant took verbal messages. There's a copy of the letter that she received from Simon de Montfort, and there's not a copy of the reply, which suggests that it was replied to verbally. Is that?
I could only imagine that she was literate, to engage in that kind of level of conversation.
She would be able to read, certainly. It has been suggested, but again, it's just speculation, that she was one of the people for which the Anchoresses, the 13th century guide to the anchorite life, was written. So yes, it's not, women were not always literate, even wealthy women at that period, so it's hard to tell.
And I think because of the association of the that document with what was going on in the Welsh marches.
Yeah.
So I think even her early education as a young child would have included thoughts around what was happening in the Welsh marches and those who were religiously fervent.
But of course we're inclined to think of literacy as a prerequisite for being thoughtful and knowledgeable, whereas it was a much more oral culture at that time, and even if she couldn't read, she would have known, for example, she would probably have been able to follow the Latin of the Mass and say her prayers in Latin. She almost certainly spoke French. We don't know whether she spoke English or not. Probably just to her servants.
I was going to say that I think the big question is, for those Norman families, at what point did they start to lose their French and speak English?
Well, she would almost certainly have spoken French. But the question is whether she could speak English at all.
Yeah.
Perhaps like, who was it spoke German to his horse? Perhaps she spoke English to her servants.
Thanks for the talk. It was really stimulating. I wonder to what extent Loretta got involved in pastoral care. You said that people came to see her, and I'm sure that's true. There must have been a lot of people sought her out for her wisdom, the fact that she'd taken herself out of everyday life and was, spending a lot of time thinking about it. She was just available. And just wondering to what extent the regular clergy got on with that, if you like. She would have been subject to the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury, I guess, you said that, yeah, she only owed obedience to him. It's a relationship really with the parish, with the vicar, and his cure of souls and his income and all that stuff.
I think the very interesting question for me was, why did Simon Langton build his palace here when Loretta was already an anchoress? So I think that kind of indicates that there was a relationship between certainly Loretta, maybe the whole of her family, and the Langtons, that maybe have developed when they were in France in exile together. But, you know, Simon Langton built his palace here after he was appointed archdeacon, so after 1227. Loretta had already been an anchoress here for 6 years by then. But why is Hackington so important? Why does the archdeacon come and build his palace here? Did he have a vicar to serve the parish? Or did he serve the parish himself? Maybe he had a number of clergy who were attendant on him as an archdeacon in those days. So, you know, they may have been, as Baldwin wanted, there may have been a group of clergy living here at Hackington and serving this church. But it's difficult to know. There's nothing written.
I mean, as Kevin said in his talk, we do know that there was a statue of St. Stephen here, which was considered miraculous. And of course, for most parts of England, we're on the way to Canterbury. So it would be an easy sort of little detour to pop in and see the statue of St. Stephen and get a quick miracle or two from him. And also probably to seek the counsel or the blessing of the Holy Lady living here. If you look on the door of the inside door of the church, carefully, you will see lots of crosses. These are sometimes referred to as pilgrim crosses. We don't know whether they were made by pilgrims. Some people say they might have been made as a sign of people making an agreement, a contract at the church door. But there's a lot of signs of people coming and going here. So that's one reason why Hackington would have been important. Sadly, I think the statue was destroyed when, at the same time as Becket's tomb was ransacked.
Some of the literature refers to an image, so I wonder whether it was an icon or a painting. Yeah. May have been a wall painting that was considered miraculous.
It's not clear whether it was in here or outside either. Philip.
I know you've got a blue plaque. Has it gone up? If not, when will it go up? And if it hasn't gone up, can we see it?
You will indeed see it.
It has gone up. You can see it. You can't see it from where you're sitting because it's just inside the chancel, which, as we don't know, but it seems likely. Oh, we're going to get
technology.
A quick special glimpse. It seems likely that is where both her anchor hold was and also where she's buried. We know she's buried in the chancel, and it would have been this end of the chancel because the altar was about halfway down the chancel, the existing chancel at that time.
I was going to suggest, Peter, that actually we stopped there and because at 12 we're going to have a service that Loretta probably would have heard herself, if not here, certainly in Paris anyway, the Angelus service being sung at midday. So we're going to have an Angelus service. It's going to be sung in Latin, which would have been the language that Loretta would have heard it in. but there are some translations. It's going to be projected onto the screen. There are also some leaflets with the service in. It's very small print, but you'll see the translation on there as well. If you want one of the leaflets, do come forward. They are at the front of the church. It will be on screen for those who'd like to stay in their places. But before 12, if there are those who need the toilet, we can give you the code for the church hall. But if you want to come and have a look at the plaque, please do come and have a look. It's just across there.
And if you want to join in with the singing, the plain song is on this. Yeah.
Oh, and I should say thank you to Peter for organising today and for publicising it, and for our Gregorian Society for coming and singing yet again for I don't know how many years it is now, but thank you for singing the Midday office for us, and to Steve for doing all the techie work today. So thank you, and thank you all for coming.
Most of which were on the screen, absolutely. And she didn't have children. No. Sort of strategy and things like that. She'd be married to the Martins, she would have. She lived in their house. And she was a buddy. Interesting.
there was a track, but I think Broad Street came down to North Court, cut across St Gregor's Park, across by Broad Street is the ring road, right? It's the city ring. And I'm thinking, I was talking about St Gregor's because that's where the old train is. That little line between Northgate.
Oh, now really. Do you think that's where they would have come to and fro?
Well, I'm not saying it. We don't know. It's a major road, isn't it?
Oh, no, sure.
Nothing all the time. Down to Northgate. I have an old train. It shows both as well. St Gregor's Park is clearly older along there, so it's a different time. It's very strange. I think the farm that was referred to was
Allcroft Grange.
if you go to the University of the Tower Hill side, you have a little roundabout, left hand track on the right, and you go down good through the village. And it's in 4 sections. Scary next to it.
Oh, really? It's got a very strange atmosphere. I sometimes go walking down the footpath and it's weird. Oh, do you? With you? No, I mean, do you want me to photograph? I was just going to photograph the track.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our service of midday prayer. Please feel free to join in with any of this that you know, but we just ask that you keep up to speed and don't slow us down. So we'll begin now.
Dominus tecum, benedicta tu Spiritus Sanctus.